is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Louise Barkill. Our top stories. Germany prepares for the new year by imposing new COVID restrictions, including a ban on large crowds.
World powers and Iran sit down for an 8th round of talks to restore a nuclear deal. Is progress close at hand?
Keeping the economy afloat, why Turkish commuters are calling on their government to keep ferries running.
It's really incredible that we've been able to accomplish so many things in space, even with the pandemic. It's just a testimony to the resilience of international space industry and exploration.
And no limits. We look back on a year that saw humans move deeper into space than ever before. New coronavirus restrictions have come into force in Germany as authorities try to curb the spread of the Omicron variant.
Private gatherings are now limited to a maximum of 10 people as long as they're vaccinated. All nightclubs have also been closed and spectators are banned from large events, including New Year celebrations.
Well, Trent Murray joins us live now from Berlin. So, Trent, why have these measures been announced now?
Well, it'll certainly be a scaled-back, more subdued set of celebrations in Germany this year as it ushers in the new year, and that is because of these new restrictions that you mentioned. They are being announced now, really, to try and stem the flow of both Omicron and the coronavirus pandemic more broadly. In many ways, a lot of health experts had called on these types of restrictions to be brought in over Christmas, but the government didn't want to go that far, instead knowing that for a lot of families it had been a tough year, and so it took a slightly more relaxed approach, I suppose you could say, in allowing these types of caps on private gatherings to not be in place for Christmas. But they have certainly not been that relaxed with New Year's Eve. As you mentioned, 10 people is the maximum number you're allowed to have over for a private New Year's Eve gathering, and all of them have to be vaccinated. The moment an unvaccinated guest is brought into the scenario, well, then the limit goes down. Only 2 guests from 2 separate households are allowed to meet. So the real priority now is to try and not just stop large groups gathering at places like Brandenburg Gate, which of course are iconic this time of year with fireworks, but also to encourage people to get vaccinated, including their booster. The latest data shows around 37% of the German population have received their booster, but the government would like to see that much higher.
So, Trent, how are people reacting to these new rules?
Well, we are seeing an increase in quite public pushback, in protest. I mean, overnight, tens of thousands took to the streets in various cities across Germany, heavily concentrated in the east of the country, states like Brandenburg and Saxony. In fact, in Saxony, 10 police officers were injured when some of the protests turned violent. And it's against that backdrop that Chancellor Olaf Scholz knows he does have a bit of a difficult balancing act, if you will, trying to convince those people to come forward and to get vaccinated, to also follow the rules. But if they don't follow those rules, then we are seeing that there could be more enforcement action on the way. In fact, we understand a vaccine mandate is being prepared early in the new year. So it is a difficult time for Germany as it ushers in the new year. Cases have slightly plateaued a little bit, but the health minister here is saying that there is a quote-unquote a massive 5th wave of Omicron on its way, and he's doing all he can to make sure the healthcare system will be able to withstand that.
Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you very much.
Well, as new COVID rules get underway in Europe and in some parts of the United Kingdom, England is taking a different path. CGTN's Guy Henderson reports.
Most of us have got used to doing this now. But beyond that, since Sunday, rules between each of the UK's 4 devolved nations now differ. For those moving freely between them, it can be hard to keep up. This lady's a visitor to Northern Ireland.
I've come over from Scotland. So everything's different. There's different types of passes. We use an NHS Inform pass over there. Over here, you have to show something when you walk in. Over there, you don't. I have no idea. I am totally lost.
For locals in each region, it is perhaps clearer.
I have a fairly good grasp, and I think that by and large, it's all pretty straightforward and sensible.
England stands apart from its Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland neighbours now. The only part of the UK not to tighten the rules, instead opting to rely on its rapid booster rollout. Despite record case numbers, hospitalisations remain way below last winter's peak. A disproportionate number of those admitted are unvaccinated. Still, up to 1 in 10 Londoners, for example, currently have COVID-19. So the public have been voluntarily cautious in recent weeks. For New Year, ministers are advising them to keep that up.
Take a lateral flow test if that makes sense. Celebrate outside if you can. Have some ventilation indoors if you can. Please remain cautious. And when we get into the new year, of course, we will see then whether we do need to take any further measures, but nothing more until then, at least.
Staying open also brings disruption, though. The Premier League, for instance, postponed its 15th match of the month on Tuesday after a COVID outbreak in the Wolves camp ahead of an away trip to Arsenal. That may be why the tightening a little approach has proven more popular for many other parts of Europe as well, along with sometimes lower vaccination rates. Germany brought back limits on social gatherings from Tuesday and will play its football without spectators. Italy has already banned gatherings over the festive period and now says it'll shorten the gap between second and third doses too. Finding the best way to stay open is a constant balancing act. For the majority, a little now could save more hassle later. England remains somewhat of an outlier. Guy Henderson, CGTN.
Belgium's government is facing renewed backlash from actors and musicians as the cultural sector says it's bearing the brunt of COVID-19 restrictions.
The country imposed new measures over the weekend, forcing cinemas, theatres and concert halls to close. But some venues are defying the order.
Benji Haya has more from Brussels.
COVID passports, a hospitality curfew, limits on the amount of people allowed to gather in restaurants and shops, and a complete ban on private meetings indoors. These, to name just a few, are the rules currently in place in Belgium. And it's having a major effect, especially on performers and event organisers who can't go about their work as normal due to these rules. In past days, thousands have protested in Brussels against the decision, or no culture, no future. And several bodies now plan to lodge an appeal with the Council of State. That's the Supreme Administrative Court of Belgium. They accuse the Belgian government of double standards for allowing busy Christmas markets or bars to continue serving customers whilst shuttering parts of the culture industry. What's still unclear is what any consequences would be for the several businesses that have decided to stay open in violation of the measures. Now, police say their first course of action will be to ensure that people are aware of the guidelines before seeking out offenders and then taking the necessary action. Meanwhile, the number of coronavirus infections, the number of hospitalisations, the number of deaths as a result of the virus, all continuing to decline in the country. Omicron, which studies show to be a milder strain of COVID-19, now accounts for 60% of cases. Scientists estimate that will increase to 95% by the end of this week. Belgium's Prime Minister hopes the impact of this will be mitigated by an expanded booster vaccination campaign, though his administration is also considering mandatory jabs in an effort to tackle this variant. Benji Haya, CGTN, Brussels.
Still to come on global business. Thousands of flights cancelled. COVID and winter weather combined to cause travel chaos in the United States.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The next kind of quickly. Why is it that high
Today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As well changes the new normal.
The world received get spectators jumping out of their seats. A sport of focus and concentration. Curling is arguably the game's most strategic event.
The 2022 Winter Games are here. Join us for all the action, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
The 8th round of talks aimed at reviving the Iran nuclear deal is continuing as Tehran sits down with world powers in Vienna. The landmark 2015 deal lifted sanctions on Iran in return for controls on its nuclear program. Johannes Pleshberger is there in the Austrian capital for us. Hi, Johannes. Iran, Russia, China, the European Union as well expressing optimism after the start of this 8th round of talks. What's the latest there on the ground?
Yes, we've been hearing a lot of upbeat comments regarding today's ongoing working groups, especially coming from Iran and Russia, but also some most recent, more negative remarks by the French delegation. But let's talk first about the positive comments. So the Russian envoy Mikhail Ulyanov said earlier on Twitter that there is undisputable progress during today's working groups. He observed a useful meeting concerning the question of the nuclear program, of Iran's nuclear program, as well as some informal meetings that actively discussed the lifting of sanctions. And the Iranian foreign minister as well was very optimistic about today's progress, he said. And his chief negotiator, Ali Bagheri Khani, mentioned that even though these optimistic progresses or remarks, the parties should still focus, he said, on the lifting of sanctions, especially on guarantees and on verification. And this was mentioned as well by China's envoy Wang Chun. Let's listen to what he said earlier or yesterday.
We also come up with a common text on nuclear activities. And secondly, we have also come up with a new common understanding on how to deal with sanction liftings, for instance. And we all agree that on the basis of the intensive discussion on sanction liftings, this round of negotiations will focus on sanction liftings.
And earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that the world powers should take a more firm position against Iran in these ongoing nuclear talks, while on the other side, China's envoy Wang Chun criticized that there is already an existing firm position by the United States, as the US had imposed additional sanctions earlier this month, despite the ongoing negotiations. And meanwhile, the French delegation has acknowledged that there is some progress, that there was some technical progress in the last round of talks, but the French delegation also said that soon Iran's escalation, they say, of its nuclear program would completely hollow out the 2015 deal. So there have been some upbeat comments, but also some more critical ones coming from the French delegation. And these ongoing nuclear talks, this 8th round, will take a break tomorrow until next Monday, not because the negotiating parties are tired, but because this venue behind me, the Palais Coburg, is not available in the upcoming days. This is the latest from Vienna.
Some optimism there, but still plenty of issues to iron out, like it sounds. Johannes Pleshberger in Vienna. Thank you.
Turkey's lira has become the world's most volatile currency. Last week it surged after billions of dollars worth of state-backed market interventions. But despite this, it has still lost almost 40% of its value against the US dollar this year.
Industries dependent on imports have been deeply affected by the currency crisis, with some taking action to protect themselves from going bankrupt. CGTN's Michal Bar-David reports now from Istanbul.
Turkey has been facing a currency crisis which saw the lira tumble to record lows before recovering some of those losses after the government announced new measures to protect citizen savings on December 20th. Inflation stands at around 21%, and many industries have been affected by the volatility in the Turkish currency, especially those relying on imports such as gas.
Thousands in Istanbul cross the Bosphorus Strait between Asia and Europe daily with motorboats and ferries. One of the most popular maritime transportation companies, Turyol, has announced it has halted some of its services due to the current conditions of the Turkish economy.
Bizi en çok etkileyen tarafı akaryakıttaki yüksek
The factor that impacted us the most is the high cost of fuel. There has been a 260% increase between the fuel we bought at the beginning of the year and the fuel we bought today.
Turyol chair John explains that several vessels have been docked and the company is considering laying off employees.
Another issue is that the technical equipment necessary for the safety of our vessels is indexed to foreign currency. This equipment is sold in a foreign currency, and we have to pay for them in liras for whatever the exchange rate is on the current day.
John stresses that access to safe and affordable public transportation is a basic right.
It is not possible to do this job without a government incentive. This is as important as education, national defense, health, etc. The state has to provide public transportation.
Many locals say they've been affected by Turyol's decision to halt some services.
A route I used to take very often has been cancelled, which requires me to walk further. This now means I'm in a rush whenever I do travel. These cancellations have affected me in many ways. If it continues, we will have great difficulty in terms of transportation. We are worried about the days to come.
Turyol has applied to local and central authorities for financial and gas support. However, requests have so far been denied. If the volatility in the Turkish currency continues, more industries will likely be affected in the year to come. Michal Bar-David, CGTN, Istanbul.
Shares in China's Evergrande Group jumped more than 8% on Tuesday. It came after the property developer said it had made initial progress in resuming construction work. The company's chairman vowed to deliver 39,000 property units in December. That's around 4 times the amount delivered in each of the previous 3 months. Evergrande, which is grappling with over $300 billion of debt, has been selling off assets and shares to raise funds.
Indonesia has lifted a ban on Boeing 737 MAX airliners after the plane was involved in a 2018 crash in the Java Sea, which killed all 189 people on board. Aviation authorities across the world grounded the 737 MAX months later after another deadly accident in Ethiopia. The lifting of the ban follows an evaluation of changes to the aircraft system by state regulators.
Japan's factory output has rebounded at the fastest pace on record, raising hopes for a strong fourth quarter. Production jumped 7.2% in November, mainly due to increased output of vehicles and plastic products. But there are concerns that persistent semiconductor shortages and the COVID-19 Omicron variant could hamper Japan's economic recovery.
Goldman Sachs says it will require employees and visitors to all its US offices to have received a COVID-19 booster shot if they're eligible, starting in February. The American multinational bank also announced staff will be required to take COVID tests twice a week from January. It comes as new coronavirus cases surge across the US.
And Apple has closed all 12 of its stores in New York City due to the rise in COVID cases. Well, let's get the latest on those two stories from CGTN's John Tarrant, who is on Wall Street for us. Hello to you, John. Let's talk about Apple in a moment.
Hello.
And start with Goldman Sachs, if you may. Why is it taking such a hard line on booster shots?
Well, you know, Robin and Naweed, the answer to that is because the bankers run this town. That is the answer to that one. And they really do. And I'm not just talking about boring, grey old men in dark jackets and red ties and green shirts like me. I'm talking about women as well. There are plenty of women on Wall Street, and collectively they're all bankers. And indeed, Jane Fraser, who was born in Scotland, runs one of the biggest banks in the world. She's based here in New York, and that's Citigroup. So the bankers are determining what's going to happen, I suspect. They always have and they always will. Also, on top of that, as I've been saying to you on this program, Americans have just had it with COVID-19. They're done. It's over. And especially, I think, because Omicron is being pronounced as not so severe as Delta and other variants that we've seen. And let me give you some examples of how things are so different here to how they are, particularly in Europe, where you are. For example, 2 million Americans flew last weekend to see their families and their friends around the country. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the main man for these things based at the White House, said, don't cancel your flights at Christmas, do go, but just be prudent. And what he meant by that was just wear a mask. So that's a very different sort of tone. Yesterday night, the CDC, which is the main public health watchdog here, basically reduced from 10 to 5 the number of days that you have to spend in isolation in America if you get a positive COVID test. There is no real federal policy for dealing with Omicron. We've had the president in the last couple of days saying it's cause for concern but not cause for panic. I understand there is a domestic travel vaccine mandate on the table, but they're not bringing it forward just yet. And then here in my own New York City, we've got Times Square and the ball drop coming up on Friday, and I will be there for the station. And they're not cancelling it like they did last year. There's going to be 15,000 people there, not 50. So dramatically fewer, but nonetheless that's happening because the mayor, Bill de Blasio, is going out of office, of course, on the 1st of January. A new mayor comes in and he wants to go out with a bang. He doesn't want it to be a whimper. So they're not cancelling these things, they're having them. And getting back to the banks, Citi, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, they all sent the staff home over Christmas. Some of them are postponing their return dates. Wells Fargo is earmarked for January the 10th. Jefferies, another big bank, has put their return date to the office back to the 17th of January. Goldman, of course, has had the vaccine and the tests in place since August. Now you're going to have a booster to get into their door. But the big one, really, the really interesting one, is James Gorman, who is the CEO of Morgan Stanley in Times Square. And he's the one that said most famously, if you can go to a New York restaurant, you can come to my office. And if you want a New York salary, then you have to actually come to the office because banking is done in person. He had to eat humble pie a little bit because they did send their staff home over Christmas. But I think the real drive in this city is to get people back into the office wherever possible. Robin and Naweed.
So, John, COVID may be over in the minds of some Americans, but Apple has taken the tough decision to close its shops in New York City.
Yes, I mean, it's, you know, this whole thing is very difficult to explain. You have to remember America is such a big country, and there are hot spots all over the country where it's worse than others. So that all plays into it as well. But generally speaking, the appetite for any kind of lockdown or any kind of closure really is not obvious, at least to me. Apple has taken a very brave decision, but again, it's a sort of bit of a half-hearted decision, really. They are closing to footfall traffic. That means people coming in through the doors. Their Manhattan and other New York borough stores now, so no walk-ins. I have it as Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Staten Island. You said 12, I have 11. You know, it doesn't really matter. It's most of them in this area, including the Fifth Avenue store, which is the one with the big cube outside, where they just had a multi-million-dollar refurbishment. So that one's going to be closed as well. Now, this is not like 2020, when Apple did close all its stores, I think, all over the country. Earlier this month, they did close down briefly Miami, Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, Ontario, and Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland. But I believe those stores are reopened now. And if you want to purchase any Apple products here in New York, you can still pick up whatever you buy by going to the store. They just won't let you in. I guess they'll kind of open the doors. Are you the guy that bought the iPhone? Yes? Okay. They'll probably throw it at you. You know, that's how it's going to be until they reopen the stores permanently. And, you know, just quickly, a little bit of history being made here today. The stock markets are roaring away into the end of the year at the moment because they've decided Omicron is not so deadly. And we are about to have the 70th record high of the S&P 500, the broad market here. If it closes in the green today, that'll be the 70th time this year that it's done so. And that is happening because there's nowhere else to put your money other than stocks at the moment. It has been deemed by others cleverer than me. Guys?
John, good to talk to you. John Terrett there in New York.
Staying in the United States, and staff shortages caused by the Omicron variant of COVID-19 coupled with severe weather has forced thousands of flights to be cancelled over the holiday period.
CGTN's Adiz Tianshan reports from Los Angeles on the travel chaos causing misery for passengers.
It's the Christmas surprise no one wanted or expected. Tens of thousands of passengers have been stranded at airports across the United States and abroad after hundreds of flights were cancelled in recent days amid an uptick during the holiday weekend.
One of my best friends is stuck in Mexico right now, and her family just tested positive, and they got kicked out of their hotel room, and it's just a whole disaster.
At Los Angeles International Airport alone, nearly 120 flights were cancelled, disrupting travel plans for as many as 200,000 passengers. According to a flight tracking website, FlightAware.com, more than 1,200 flights in the U.S. and some 6,000 globally have been cancelled.
I actually came here for my dad's funeral. I'll go ahead and share that. And we feel like he's been watching over us the whole time. So we feel really blessed, and we feel like this plane's going to take off, and he's up there helping us out.
While some cancellations were due to bad weather, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, others were largely due to staffing shortages, as many airline workers called in sick following a number of coronavirus outbreaks.
The sheer volume of cases that we're seeing now, yesterday we had 214,000 cases. Even with a diminution in severity, we still could have a surge on hospitals, particularly among the unvaccinated, which they were really worried about.
Officials are urging people to scale down or cancel their New Year's Eve plans at a time when airlines are struggling to meet travel demands with healthy staff. Adiz Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
Coming up on Global Business Europe, 5 months on, we return to see how flood-hit victims in Germany were able to celebrate Christmas.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Naweed Jabakil and Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Germany prepares for the new year by imposing new COVID restrictions, including a ban on large crowds.
World powers and Iran sit down for an 8th round of talks to restore a nuclear deal.
And keeping the economy afloat, Turkish commuters are calling on the government to keep inflation-hit ferries running.
Over the summer, heavy rains caused mass flooding in western Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands.
Bridges, homes and businesses were all destroyed along some 40 kilometres of Germany's Ahr Valley when it was inundated by the high waters.
Now, 5 months on, Natalie Carney returns to one of the area's most affected communities to see how residents are celebrating Christmas.
This is the beautiful Ahr Valley, a region in western Germany famed for its wine production. But now, the only visitors are NGOs and journalists. Happy Christmas decorations in the village of Dernau mark a sharp contrast to the gutted buildings they sit upon. 86% of the houses here suffered tremendous water damage. More than half of them are now uninhabitable, says Mayor Alfred Sebastian.
I can't imagine how devastating this must have been for the people who lived here.
Also wir hatten 1.800 Einwohner.
We had a population of 1,800, but we're considerably fewer now. Emergency shelters were created and then people looked for a free flat somewhere within a radius of 100 kilometres. They moved there but drove to Dernau every day and are now looking at rebuilding their house.
134 people lost their lives in the Ahr Valley, 11 in Dernau, and 2 more committed suicide. Resident Peter Wild says the water at his house, 3 blocks from the Ahr River, rose to 7 meters, completely flooding the first and second floors.
Und da haben wir uns dann geflüchtet. Aber
we basically fled to the top floor, but there were also people sitting on the roof. Nothing was working anymore. We could not get any information to the outside world, and we also got no news for 3 days. We were reported missing because friends could not reach us.
waren wir vermisst gemeldet, weil Freunde nicht uns erreicht haben.
Brown water lines are still visible on some houses, while empty lots are all that is visible of others. NGOs have set up temporary shelters for those who have nowhere to go. There's not a single life in the Ahr Valley that was not touched by the floods.
Dernau used to be buzzing with tourists, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter. But now, 5 months after the floods, the only sounds you hear are those of rebuilding.
Construction still carries on late into the night. The German federal government and the 16 states agreed to a $35 billion reconstruction fund back in August, but Mayor Sebastian says that money has not yet reached the victims. He is calling for a national flood protection plan. While emergency warnings were issued, there was no indication of the enormity of the impending floods, he says.
We must create more space for the river. We have to build retention basins to have a flood concept here, and it has to be set up and implemented in the next few years so that it is worthy of its name, so such a flood does not happen here again. Something must be done so that we can live here without fear.
But such a flood will happen again, says climate experts. The effects of climate change mean that more catastrophic weather events are certain. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Dernau, Germany.
As we approach the end of 2021, we've been asking our reporters around Europe what stories have stood out for them and what they think might define 2022. CGTN's business correspondent Juliette Mann reflects on what's been a difficult year for companies and consumers alike.
What stood out for me as the biggest story of 2021? Well, let me give you some clues. Timber, crisps or potato chips, and a car that runs on petrol. Yes, supply chain issues. I was talking to a fund manager friend of mine, and they were really excited to have their first transatlantic flight to see clients face to face since travel restrictions lifted. And they looked out the window as the plane came into land, and the view was of a long line of container ships queuing to get to port to unload. This has been a year of stuff stuck in transit. Back in March, that enormous container ship, Ever Given, got wedged in the Suez Canal. Do you remember that? There were huge repercussions. There were hundreds of vessels that got stranded either side, and it went on for an awfully long time. They say the cost to international trade was about 15% of it, at $9.6 billion a day. It's just extraordinary. And all kinds of businesses were affected. Transport, manufacturing, retail, not to mention insurance. Strains in global systems like dated infrastructure, a lack of investment, slow digitalisation, they've all been exacerbated by the pandemic and by Brexit. Another reason for the severe shortage of truck drivers in the UK. So while oil producers were pumping, fuel stations run dry. I remember driving to 6 different petrol stations and then queuing for 2 hours when I found one was open to fill up my car. And if you've had any DIY or home renovations plans, you might have found that the shortage of timber has been a problem holding things up. Really, supply has really shrunk there, and that's hit the whole construction industry. And glitches at the factory of the people who make these snacks created weeks and weeks of issues. They say that the disruption to supplies is going to last well into the new year, well into January. They've even issued a newspaper advertisement to apologise to customers, to apologise to shoppers. So shortages, empty shelves, dissatisfied customers, those are things that are very likely to continue into the year ahead. And I'm not quite sure whether or not I should eat these, because they might fetch a good price if I put them on eBay. Now, looking ahead to 2022, I think the big conversation is going to be about the future of work. Having listened closely to big bosses, to strategists and to market watchers, I think we're on the cusp of a new industrial revolution. One that is going to completely shake up the way we function in the workplace and the way that business leaders lead. Now, throughout the pandemic, we've had this forced experiment, haven't we? Working from home, remote working, maybe a combination of all of that. There are pros and cons. It doesn't work for all sectors. It doesn't work for all kinds of businesses. It doesn't work for all people. But what we have seen is a big change, not just in the way that companies operate, but in the demands that employers have. On the other hand, it's not all new. The technology we're using, like Zoom for virtual meetings, that's been around for a decade. We live in a 24-hour society, and the concept of flexible working is very much already part of the culture in places like Finland and much of Scandinavia, where employees have the right to start their working day later, end it later, so long as they get their work done. But what the pandemic experience has done has shifted thinking. Already we've seen many companies, many governments, many organisations reimagining their futures to be greener and to be cleaner. So now I anticipate they're going to rip up the rule book. That 9 to 5 that we're so used to is probably going to become the exception rather than the norm, as countries look at ways, as the economies reopen, looking at ways to retain the staff that they got. So perhaps 2022 is going to be the year when things are done differently.
Rahul Pathak is CGTN's correspondent in Madrid. He told my colleague Jamie Owen that the Afghan crisis had a particular impact on him.
Yeah, it certainly was. It certainly was a story that had a big impact on me personally. So, yeah, this was about the Kostani families who who fled Kabul following the return of the Taliban to power, and those extraordinary pictures we saw of people trying to get out of Kabul airports. And they were on one of those transport planes, and they made it to Spain. And we followed their arrival in Spain and their subsequent attempts to find asylum in Europe. Now, the head of the family, Nurzia Kouristani, the matriarch of the family, if you like, now she used to be a spokesperson for the government, or the previous government, on women's rights. Now, that made her a potential target with the Taliban coming back into power. Now, I actually asked her in our interview what she thought the future was for women's rights under the current regime, and basically it got too much for her. She started crying, and you could see the pain in her eyes of the thoughts of that prayers of all the people, all the women left back home, and it was almost too much for her, as I said. Now, the Kouristanis are a very, very big extended family, very common in Afghanistan. It actually reminded me a lot of my family growing up, a big Indian family living in the UK. They're actually showing us some of their holiday snaps, and the holiday snaps we had exactly the same. We all go out as a huge family, 9 or 10 in a clan on our holidays. And the fact that they've... one thing that my grandmother always wanted to do is keep our family together, no matter what. And Nurzani was exactly the same. She wanted to keep her family together, but she was terrified that they were going to get split up because they would get asylum in different countries. But as it's turned out, that they've all managed to settle there. She didn't settle in Spain. They've gone to Belgium, and they've all settled there. So good news for them, but obviously many people back home in Afghanistan not quite so lucky.
Rahul, let's look at the year ahead, and I guess that Spain's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic is going to be one of the big stories for you in 2022.
Yeah, it's going to dominate everything. I mean, it's a massive year for the economy. It's a massive year for the Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, as he shows that he is the man to help this economy recover. Remember, Spain's economy was the worst hit out of all the major European economies as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. But this time around, so 2022, Pedro Sanchez will actually have the money, courtesy of the EU, to kind of push forward his economic agenda. Now, back in May of this year, he announced something called España 2050, which is a huge development plan for the country aimed at improving a whole raft of things, including education, health, pensions, jobs, taxes, and the environment over the next 3 decades. Now, obviously, this is a massive project. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think he's going to need to show some evidence that with all this EU money, that some changes happening for the better as Spain tries to recover from the pandemic, because as we've seen, that a lot of the major EU economies are recovering, bouncing back relatively well from the pandemic, and Spain are much, much slower for some reason. It's being put down to things like weak household spending, supply chain bottlenecks, as we've been seeing at the moment. So Pedro Sanchez is going to be hoping that he can turn things around in 2022 ahead of a possible general election in 2023.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, meet the Olympic dentists. We take you inside Beijing's Wukersong Stadium, where preparations are underway for ice hockey clashes and injuries.
Hello, I'm Stephen Cole. What's on your agenda this week? I know when it comes to news, you're spoilt for choice. So many channels, so many opinions. But it's time to step off the news roundabout, time to cut out the noise, get to the heart of the real story with a talk show with a difference. I'll be finding out what the world is thinking by talking to the global decision makers and helping you set your own news agenda. Remember, we don't just report the news, we set the agenda.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Roger, you loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. China says the United States has put astronauts in danger by ignoring its obligations under space treaties.
Earlier this month, China lodged 2 complaints with the United Nations against the American billionaire Elon Musk. China says its space station was forced to avoid 2 collisions with satellites launched by his company, SpaceX. The claims haven't been independently verified.
China began the construction of its first permanent space station earlier this year and hopes to have it fully functional over the coming months. Some aerospace experts say the hugely ambitious project has marked China's coming of age in outer space.
James Head, a professor of geological sciences at Brown University, has also trained astronauts in geology and helped choose landing sites for the Apollo lunar program. Jamie spoke to him about the momentous year.
It's really incredible that we've been able to accomplish so many things in space, even with the pandemic. It's just a testimony to the resilience of international space industry and exploration. I would say, looking back, there are a number of things that I think having all the missions that we've been able to accomplish into the solar system. China has landed a rover on Mars, so is the United States. ESA is coming next. We have 5 missions in the queue that are coming up for Venus. We actually returned samples robotically, China's Chang'e 5 mission, for the first time in over 40 years from the moon, and it's just amazing. It completely made the excitement in the lunar science community, and the results from that mission are stunning, really stunning.
China will look back on the year as the year when Chinese space exploration came of age.
First of all, China joined the rest of humanity in Tiangong, essentially, space station, creating another international village in low Earth orbit. So, you know, it's another village. They're literally villages, international villages. The International Space Station's been up there over 20 years, and now China will be taking international partners into their space station. It's like we're beginning to live in low Earth orbit. Villages are starting to spring up, and they're great for research and other types of things. So that was just one accomplishment of China. And then, of course, landing on the surface of Mars, a rover on the surface of Mars for the first time, first try, and then returning samples from the surface of the moon from a very, very critical place. A big missing chapter in our understanding of lunar history.
One of the downsides of all this activity in space, of course, is the increasing amount of space debris and the rather controversial ways of trying to get rid of duff satellites and other bits of kit.
One other accomplishment in the last year, it's hard to think of it as an accomplishment, but has been the increased awareness of space pollution, space trash, if you will. And essentially, we have so many objects up there now that we have to really keep close track of all of these things because they're flying around at extremely high speeds, and one impact could put a hole in the space station, for example, and doom it. The increased awareness of trash in space and trying to keep space peaceful for everyone is really, really, I think, one of the big awarenesses of this past year. Not only are we beginning to understand the fragility of our own environment, down on the Earth in terms of climate and weather, but also space. It's not just a trash can, folks. It's really something we have to take care of.
James, let's look ahead to the new year. What does 2022 hold? What should we look out for?
Well, there's so many exciting things. You know, I tell my students every year, starting graduate students, this is the best year you could be coming into planetary science. And sometimes I think, am I really telling them the truth every year? But it just gets better and better. And this coming year is going to be fantastic. We have 5 missions that are underway in the next decade to go to Venus. And of course, the results from the James Webb Space Telescope. We can see the stars in the sky, but what do they look like in detail? What are the galaxies? What are the cosmos look like? And the James Webb Telescope is going to reach out, and really that's going to be a big deal in the future to discovery after discovery as deep space becomes our neighborhood. It's going to be fantastic. So there's so many things going on. I'm just so excited.
An investigation is underway after a small passenger jet crashed into a residential area in Southern California. Authorities say there are no survivors and the number of victims hasn't been disclosed. The plane was due to land in El Cajon to the east of San Diego on Monday evening.
The jury is set to resume its deliberations in the sex trafficking trial of British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell at a federal court in New York. She is accused of recruiting and grooming teenage girls for sex with her former boyfriend, financier Jeffrey Epstein, and his associates. Maxwell has pleaded not guilty to all the charges.
America has halved the isolation period for coronavirus cases with no symptoms. Health authorities say people should now isolate for 5 days instead of 10. The White House medical advisor says the measures will allow people a faster return to work or school.
Authorities in the Chinese city of Xi'an say they have expanded mass testing for its 13 million residents. The city is currently in lockdown and reported a further 175 symptomatic cases on Tuesday. No infections of the Omicron variant have been reported so far.
A COVID-19 testing error in Australia has seen almost 1,000 people receive text messages confirming negative results when their tests were yet to be processed. The laboratory in Sydney has blamed the false negatives on human error, describing the system as under severe strain. On Tuesday, Australia reported 11,000 new cases, its highest number of new daily infections since the pandemic began.
Heavy snowfall has brought parts of northern and western Japan to a standstill, with many roads left impassable. More than 1 metre of snow fell in some places, with more expected overnight. People are being advised to avoid non-essential travel along the western coastline, where strong winds and lightning are also forecast.
Ice hockey is a contact sport, and when it comes to the Olympics, the rules say a dentist must be on hand in case there are any injuries.
Wukesong Stadium will be one of the ice hockey venues for the 2022 Beijing Winter Games, and CGTN's Sen Zeyuan has been to visit the dental clinic there, which will be on standby for any accidents.
You might think this is just a regular dental clinic, but it's quite special. This clinic is set up at Wukesong Stadium, where ice hockey events will be held during Winter Games. Ice hockey is the only sport that demands a dentist to be on site. They are capable of handling small operations, but athletes will be sent off to a hospital 3 minutes away from the stadium if further work is needed.
We need to train the medical staff based on the drafted plans and the characteristics of ice hockey so that they are familiar with the stadium.
The clinic is just one part of the medical station that is set up to handle emergencies and injuries at the venue.
They are experts, and there's no doubt about their expertise since they are all from top hospitals in Beijing, but they need training to be ready for their roles during the games.
Teams of medical workers will be stationed at different levels of the stadium, and the main challenge is watching out for emergencies and carry out COVID prevention and control protocols.
Respiratory diseases are more likely to spread during winter. We have specifically tested out measures for prevention control methods at the stadium. You can see the divider we have here. Unless it's an emergency, we'll make sure there's only one patient in every room.
Besides the independent dental clinic, 5 ambulances and a mobile CT scan will also be ready with a team of medical workers on standby. But that's not all. There's also the medical station. The medical station includes 2 parts, an emergency room and a consultation room. The divider is to ensure patient privacy. Staff on site say they hope people will enjoy a safe and healthy Winter Games at the Wukesong Stadium without needing their services. But they say if needed, they are here to help. It's not all about medicine here. Some foods, such as salads and Western dishes, will also be made on site. Chinese food will be provided by contracted service providers across Beijing. The manager says it is to ensure the meals are both authentic and fresh.
The Olympic Games take place during the Chinese Spring Festival. It's a good time to display our traditional food. We've prepared dumplings and tangyuan to introduce some of our unique dishes and food culture.
This will be the dining hall for Olympic personnel once the Games begin. Food will be delivered here by the service providers and repacked for meal times. By the game starts, it will still be the Spring Festival season in Beijing. And the staff here say they hope it is a warm and safe time in Beijing. Chen Ziyuan, CGTN, Beijing.
A reminder of our top headlines. Germany prepares for the new year by imposing new COVID restrictions, including a ban on large crowds.
World powers and Iran sit down for an 8th round of talks to restore a nuclear deal.
And keeping the economy afloat, Turkish commuters call on the government to keep ferries running amid currency volatility.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow us on our social media channels on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place, from all the team here in London. Goodbye.
Goodbye.